The room went quiet so fast it felt like someone had cut the power. I heard it before I fully processed what was happening. Chairs scraping back across the hardwood, feet hitting the floor, and then 30 voices in unison, cutting through the soft piano music and the clink of champagne flutes. Attention on deck. 114 wedding guests turned to look at me. My brother's new mother in law dropped her fork. And my mother, the woman who had called me 3 days earlier to tell me very calmly that my being in the Navy was a lot for people to process, went the color of old chalk. I want to tell you that I had planned all of this, that I walked into that reception hall knowing exactly what would happen. But the truth is, I was just trying to get through dinner without crying in the bathroom. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, which means I grew up surrounded by military. Naval Air Station Beaufort was 15 minutes from our house. Fighter jets rattled our windows on Tuesday mornings. Half the fathers on our street had done at least one deployment. It was just the air we breathed. My father, though, had never served. He ran an insurance office downtown, coached Little League for 12 years, and had very specific ideas about what his children's lives should look like. My older brother Trevor was going to take over the business. I was going to go to college, get married, and not make things complicated. That's an actual quote. I was 17. I had told him at dinner, spaghetti night, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that you remember forever because of what gets said in the middle of it, that I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. I had done the research. I had already talked to my guidance counselor. I had a plan. My father put down his garlic bread and looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something you have to be patient about. Laurel, he said, that's a very hard life, and not really designed for, he paused, for someone like you. My mother didn't disagree. She was better at softening things. She talked about how physical it would be, how I'd be far from home, how the men could be rough. She wasn't mean about it. She just made it sound like the Navy was something that happened to other people's daughters, not hers. Trevor thought it was funny. He was 22 then, already working at my father's office, already exactly where they'd always planned for him to be. He laughed and said, "You'd actually go through boot camp?" "Yes," I said. "Give it a week," he said. He was joking. I don't think he meant to be cruel. But I heard it the way you hear things when you're 17 and everyone in the room is telling you, no, like a door closing. I applied anyway. I didn't tell them until after I got in. Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island is not designed to make you comfortable. That's the entire point. 12 weeks. Sleep deprivation. Physical training that made my legs shake on the stairs. Academic work that never stopped. Inspections where someone ran a white glove along the top of your locker and you prayed. I was one of 12 women in my class. We were watched more carefully, criticized more specifically, held to a standard that didn't have much flexibility in it. I loved almost every day of it. Not because it was easy, because it was real. Because every single morning I knew exactly what was required of me, and I either did it or I didn't. There was no gray area. No one asking me to make things less complicated. I graduated. I commissioned as an ensign. I called my parents from a payphone outside the ceremony hall because my cell phone had died and I just needed to tell someone. My father said, "Well, okay. Be careful." My mother asked if I'd eaten. Over the years, I called regularly. I came home when I could, Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving, once for my grandmother's funeral, where I sat in the second pew in my service dress blues and felt like I was dressed for the wrong event. Nobody said anything about the uniform. Nobody asked about my work. We talked about Trevor's new house and my mother's book club, and whether the Publix on Boundary Street had gotten better parking. 14 years passed like that. I was promoted to lieutenant, then lieutenant commander, then commander. I did 3 deployments. I served as executive officer on a guided missile destroyer out of Norfolk. I put in for captain and got it. When I made captain, 2-6, 4 gold stripes on my sleeve, a command of my own. I called home on a Tuesday night, which is still spaghetti night apparently, and my father said, "That's great, Laurel. Trevor's thinking about buying a boat. Did you know that?" I said yes and asked what kind. That was the conversation. Trevor got engaged the year I took command of USS Lake Champlain, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser out of San Diego. His fiancée was a woman named Abigail, who taught second grade in Charlotte and had, by all accounts, never dropped a single thing in her life. She was organized and warm, and her family was enormous in the way that Southern families get when everyone stays in the same two counties for 4 generations. The wedding was in October, in Beaufort. Of course it was. Everything in our family happened in Beaufort. I got the invitation in August. And tucked inside in my mother's handwriting on a cream note card stationery, Laurel, we're so excited you're coming. One thought the wedding is very elegant and we want everyone to feel comfortable. We thought it might be best if you came in a dress rather than the uniform. Abigail's family is lovely, but some of them aren't used to military, and we don't want anything to pull focus from the bride. Love, Mom. I read it twice. Then I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for about 4 days. I want to be clear about what that note said to me. It wasn't don't be distracting. It was who you are is distracting. 14 years, 3 deployments, a command. And my mother's concern was whether Abigail's relatives from Greenville would feel awkward. I called her. I tried to be reasonable about it. I explained that wearing my service dress uniform to a formal event is appropriate, that it's the military equivalent of a dress uniform, that it's how naval officers attend formal occasions, that I wouldn't be out of place. She said, I know, honey. I just think it's a lot. There it was. That phrase again. A lot. I told her I'd think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 6 weeks. I thought about every Christmas I'd driven home in civilian clothes because I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Every conversation that moved past my career, like water around a rock. Every time Trevor's new truck or promotion or fantasy football league got more airtime at the dinner table than the ship I was commanding. I thought about a woman I'd served with, a petty officer first class named Renata, who had done 4 deployments, survived a collision at sea, and once told me that the hardest part of coming home wasn't the adjustment. It was the way her family treated her service like a hobby she'd finally grown out of. I opened my closet the Wednesday before the wedding. The service dress blue uniform hung on the right side, pressed and exact, the 4 gold stripes bright against the dark fabric, my ribbons in their proper order above the left breast pocket, my command pin centered below. On the left side hung the dress I'd bought in August. Navy blue, appropriate length, the kind of thing you wear when you're trying not to take up too much space. I stood there for a long time. Then I got my uniform cover off the shelf, checked the eagle device on the front, and started ironing my white gloves. The reception was held at the Old Bay Club, which is a white column building on the waterfront that does weddings and anniversary parties and retirement dinners and has been doing them since about 1987. The ceremony had been beautiful. I sat in the 4th row and watched my brother cry when Abigail walked down the aisle and felt something loosen in my chest. Something I hadn't known was tight. I drove to the reception separately. I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I checked my ribbons in the visor mirror. I put on my cover. I got out of the car. The entrance to the Old Bay Club's main hall is a set of double doors that open into the reception space, and when the coordinator opened them for me, I was among the last to arrive, which I'd timed deliberately. The room was already full. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces with white roses and magnolia leaves, a string quartet finishing something that might have been Debussy. I heard him before I understood what was happening. A man near the back left, in a dark suit, who came to his feet, fast and clean, the way you only stand when it's muscle memory. Attention on deck. And then it happened like a wave. Table by table, left to right, back to front, men in suits and women in cocktail dresses who I didn't know, who had no reason to know me, who just knew what 4 gold stripes and a command pin meant, coming to their feet. I counted later, 31. 31 people in that room who had served or were currently serving, rising without being asked. The string quartet stopped. The room was very quiet. I removed my cover, held it under my arm, and walked to my table. My face was perfectly still. I have spent 14 years learning to keep my face perfectly still. My father stood up last. He wasn't military. He didn't know the protocol. He just saw everyone else standing and stood. I sat next to my mother at dinner. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about the centerpieces. She admired them. I agreed they were lovely. The salmon was good. The string quartet started up again. Then she put her hand on my arm. I didn't know, she said. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't say anything. Those people stood up, she said. They all stood up, she said. They all stood up. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. She's not a woman who apologizes easily. She was raised in a house where you moved forward, you didn't relitigate. But she said, I've been wrong about this for a long time. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a transformation scene. It was a 63-year-old woman at her son's wedding in a cream-colored dress telling the truth out loud for the first time about something she'd been getting wrong for 14 years. I put my hand over hers and we didn't say anything else about it. My father came by during the reception. He shook my hand. My father is a handshaker. He's always been a handshaker and held it longer than usual. I looked up your ship, he said. The Lake Champlain. I didn't realize how big it was. About 567 feet, I said. He nodded slowly. I'm going to call you more, he said. If that's all right. It's all right, I said. He nodded again and went back to his table, and I watched him sit down next to my mother and say something in her ear, and she laughed. This little surprise laugh, the kind she only does when something catches her off guard. The part I didn't expect was Trevor. He found me near the end of the night when the dancing had started and the older relatives were making their way toward the exits. He'd had 2 glasses of champagne and his tie was loosened and he looked younger than he had in years, the way men look on their wedding nights when all the planning is finally over. He said, You know, I had no idea. I said, About what? About any of it, he said. What you actually do. I googled Navy captain last week and I read about it for an hour and I still don't think I fully get it. I laughed, genuinely. You command a warship, he said. Like an actual, he stopped. When I said you'd be back in a week, when we were kids, I've been thinking about that. You were 22, I said. I was an idiot, he said. You were 22, I said again. He put his arms around me in the parking lot later, while Abigail was saying goodbye to her aunts, and he held on longer than brothers usually do. Come to dinner when you're home for Christmas, he said, and bring. He paused, trying to remember something he'd read. Bring some stories. I want to know what it's actually like. It's a lot, I told him. He laughed. He laughed. He knew what I meant. I've been asked a few times since then whether I planned it, whether walking in late in uniform was calculated, whether I knew what would happen when those doors opened. I want to be honest. I knew what 4 gold stripes mean to anyone who has served. I knew there would likely be veterans in that room, because there are veterans in almost every room in Beaufort, South Carolina. I knew that military courtesy doesn't disappear just because you're wearing a suit instead of a uniform, but I didn't walk in there for the reaction. I walked in there because 14 years of being made to feel like my service was something to minimize had finally run up against the version of me that commands a 10,000-ton warship and is responsible for 400 lives, and that version of me won. There's a protocol question I should answer here, because I know people wonder about it. When you're in the Navy and you enter a space, even a civilian event, if service members are present, it's not unusual for them to acknowledge rank. It doesn't mean civilians are required to stand. It means that the men and women who served recognize what the uniform represents. They stood not because of me specifically, but because of what those 4 stripes mean, because of every person who ever wore them. My cover came off when I walked inside, because that's correct. You don't wear your cover indoors. A captain would know. I went back to San Diego 3 days after the wedding. The ship was in the middle of a pre-deployment workup cycle, which means long days and longer nights and 1,000 details that demand your full attention. I was grateful for it. My father called on the following Tuesday. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked questions I'd never heard from him before. How deployments work, what a combat systems officer does, what the Pacific is like in February. Small questions, honest ones. the kind you ask when you're actually trying to understand something instead of just waiting for the topic to change. My mother sent a card. No note card this time, a real card, the kind with a painting of the ocean on the front. Inside, she'd written, "We are proud of you. We should have said it more. We're going to try to do better. Love, Mom." 8 words that should have been said 100 times over 14 years. I'm not going to pretend that a card fixes everything. It doesn't. There are dinners I can't get back, conversations that went the wrong direction, a version of my 20s where I stopped calling as much because it was easier than feeling like a visitor in my own family. But a card is a beginning. And I've learned in the Navy that you don't always get to choose where things start over. You just have to be willing to move when they do. Trevor texted me in November. He and Abigail were looking into volunteering with a veterans transition program in Charlotte, helping former service members translate their military experience into civilian resumes, navigate the VA system, find employment. He asked if I knew anyone who ran programs like that, if I had any contacts who could point them in the right direction. I spent about an hour making calls. There's a painting on the bulkhead outside my stateroom on Lake Champlain, a print of Winslow Homer's The Blue Boat, which I bought at a museum shop in Boston 6 years ago because the light in it reminded me of early mornings in the Beaufort estuary, before everything got complicated. I've looked at it on a lot of hard mornings, in a lot of time zones, in whatever weather the Pacific decides to hand us. The morning after I got back from the wedding, I stood in front of it for a few minutes before quarters. I've spent a lot of years trying to be enough for a family that wasn't sure what to do with me. I don't think that's a unique story. There are people in uniform all over this country who know exactly what I'm describing. The holidays that feel slightly off, the conversations that skate past, the sense that who you are at work and who you are at home don't quite connect. I don't have a clean resolution for that. Some things don't resolve cleanly. But I know what happened in a room in Beaufort, South Carolina, on a Saturday in October, when 31 people got to their feet for no other reason than that they recognized what service looks like. I know my father Googled my ship. I know my brother held on longer than brothers usually do. And I know that the uniform I almost left in the closet is hanging back in its place now, pressed and exact, ready for the next time someone needs to be reminded of what it means. That's enough for me. For now, that's more than enough. I've thought a lot about what actually changed that night in Beaufort and what didn't. The easy version of this story is that I walked into a room in uniform. 31 people stood up, and my family finally understood. Clean cause, clean effect. But that's not quite how it works. And I think you know that too. What actually happened was the result of 14 years of choices. 14 years of showing up anyway. To training I wasn't supposed to want, to a career I wasn't supposed to need, to phone calls home that went nowhere, to holidays where I sat in civilian clothes so no one would feel uncomfortable. Every single one of those choices, made quietly, without an audience, without anyone standing up. That's the part nobody sees in the moment. The long, unwitnessed stretch of it. I think about Renata sometimes, the petty officer I mentioned, the one who told me the hardest part of coming home was being treated like her service was a phase. She made the same choices I made, in harder conditions, with less recognition. She didn't get a room full of veterans rising to their feet. She got a family dinner when nobody asked. And she kept going. That's not a small thing, that's actually the whole thing. What I've come to understand is that integrity isn't something you perform for the moment when people are finally watching. It's what you build during all the years they aren't. My father didn't look up the Lake Champlain because of what happened at the reception. He looked it up because something shifted in him when he saw what 14 years of quiet commitment actually looks like when it's standing in a room. I just gave him something visible to point at. The work had already been done. My mother's note, "We should have said it more." Those words matter to me, not because they fix anything, but because saying a hard, true thing out loud takes its own kind of courage. She's 63 years old, and she chose honesty over comfort. That's not nothing. I've watched people half her age refuse to do the same. Trevor asking about the veterans program in Charlotte, that's the part of this story I hold on to most. Because that's what happens when someone finally understands something. They don't just feel differently, they do differently. That's the difference between a moment and a change. I spent a long time being angry, quietly, at being made to feel like too much. And I understand now that the anger wasn't wrong, it was honest. But I also understand that the most powerful thing I ever did wasn't walking into that room in uniform. It was deciding, over and over, across 14 years, to keep becoming the person I meant to be, regardless of whether anyone at the dinner table noticed. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not the moment when 31 strangers stood up, but the decade and a half before it, when I stood up for myself in rooms when nobody else did. The uniform is hanging back in its place, pressed and ready, and I'm still here,